Part 5. Neoliberalism, Privatization, and Redistribution. Free Market Reforms and the Reduction of Statism. Kevin A. Carson, 2008. Objectivist scholar Chris Sciabara, in his brilliant book Total Freedom, called for a dialectical libertarianism. By dialectical analysis, Sciabara means to grasp the nature of a part by viewing it systematically, that is, as an extension of the system within which it is embedded. Individual parts receive their character from the whole of which they are a part, and from their function within that whole. This means it is a mistake to consider any particular form of state intervention in isolation without regard to the role it plays in the overall system. Footnote: Chris Matthew Sciabara, Dialectics and Liberty. The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, 55.7, September 2005, pages 34 to 38. Another libertarian, blogger Arthur Silber, contrasts dialectical libertarianism with what he calls atomistic libertarianism, whose approach is to focus on the basic principles involved, but with scant or no attention paid to the overall context in which the principles are being analyzed. In this manner, this approach treats principles like Plato's forms. Atomistic libertarians argue as if the society in which one lives is completely irrelevant to an analysis of any problem at all. To determine the function a particular form of state intervention serves in the structure of state power, we must first ask what has been the historical objective of the state. This is where libertarian class analysis comes in. The single greatest work I'm aware of on libertarian class theory is Roderick Long's article Toward a Libertarian Theory of Class. Footnote: Roderick T. Long, Toward a Libertarian Theory of Class, Social Philosophy and Policy 15.2, Summer 1998, pages 303 to 349. Long categorizes ruling class theories as either statocratic or plutocratic, based on the respective emphasis they place on the state apparatus and the plutocracy, the wealthy private sector beneficiaries of government intervention, as components of the ruling class. The default tendency in mainstream libertarianism is a high degree of statocracy, to the point not only of quite properly emphasizing the necessary role of state coercion in enabling legal plunder, Frederick Bastiat's term, by the plutocracy, but of downplaying the significance of the plutocracy even as beneficiaries of statism. This means treating the class interests associated with the state as ad hoc and fortuitous. Although statocratic theory treats the state, in Franz Oppenheimer's phrase, as the organized political means to wealth, it still tends to view government as merely serving the exploitative interests of whatever assortment of political factions happens to control it at any given time. This picture of how the state works does not require any organic relation between the various interest groups controlling it at any time, or between them and the state. It might be controlled by a disparate array of interest groups, including licensed professionals, rent-seeking corporations, farmers, regulated utilities, and big labor. The only thing they have in common is that they happen to be currently the best at latching onto the state. Murray Rothbard's position was far different. Rothbard, Long argues, saw the state as controlled by a primary group that has achieved a position of structural hegemony, a group central to class consolidation and crisis in contemporary political economy. Rothbard's approach to this problem is in fact highly dialectical in its comprehension of the historical, political, economic, and social dynamics of class. I have argued in the past that the corporate economy is so closely bound up with the power of the state that it makes more sense to think of the corporate ruling class as a component of the state, in the same way that landlords were a component of the state under the old regime. Blogger Brad Spangler uses the analogy of a gunman and a bagman to illustrate the relationship. Let's postulate two sorts of robbery scenarios. In one, a lone robber points a gun at you and takes your cash. All libertarians would recognize this as a micro-example of any kind of government at work, resembling most closely state socialism. In the second, depicting state capitalism, one robber, the literal apparatus of government, keeps you covered with a pistol, while the second, representing state-allied corporations, just holds the bag that you have to drop your wristwatch, wallet, and car keys in. To say that your interaction with the bagman was a voluntary transaction is an absurdity. Such nonsense should be condemned by all libertarians. Both gunman and bagman together are the true state. Given this perspective, it doesn't make much sense to consider particular proposals for deregulating or cutting taxes without regard to the role the taxes and regulations play in the overall structure of state capitalism. That's especially true considering that most mainstream proposals for free market reform are generated by the very class interests that benefit from the corporate state. No politico-economic system has ever approximated total statism in the sense that everything not forbidden is compulsory. In every system, there is a mixture of compulsory and discretionary behavior. The ruling class allows some amount of voluntary market exchange within the interstices of a system whose overall structure is defined by coercive state intervention. The choice of what areas to leave to voluntary exchange, just as much as of what to subject to compulsory regulation, reflects the overall strategic picture of the ruling class. The total mixture of statism and market activity will be chosen as most likely, in the estimation of the ruling class, to maximize net exploitation by the political means. Primary and secondary interventions. Some forms of state intervention are primary. They involve the privileges, subsidies, and other structural bases of economic exploitation through the political system. This has been the primary purpose of the state, the organized political means to wealth, exercised by and for a particular class of people. Some forms of intervention, however, are secondary. Their purpose is stabilizing or ameliorative. They include welfare state measures, Keynesian demand management, and the like, whose purpose is to limit the most destabilizing side effects of privilege and to secure the long-term survival of the system. Unfortunately, the typical free market reform issuing from corporate interests involves eliminating only the ameliorative or regulatory forms of intervention while leaving intact the primary structure of privilege and exploitation. The strategic priorities of principled libertarians should be just the opposite. First, to dismantle the fundamental structural forms of state intervention whose primary effect is to enable exploitation, and only then to dismantle the secondary ameliorative forms of intervention that serve to make life bearable for the average person living under a system of state-enabled exploitation. As blogger Jim Henley put it, remove the shackles before the crutches. To welcome the typical free market proposals as steps in the right direction without regard to their effect on the overall functioning of the system is comparable to the Romans welcoming the withdrawal of the Punic center at Cannae as a step in the right direction. Hannibal's battle formation was not the first step in a general Carthaginian withdrawal from Italy, and you can be sure that the piecemeal privatizations, deregulations, and tax cuts proposed are not intended to reduce the amount of wealth extracted by the political means. Regulations and increasing statism. Moreover, regulations that limit and constrain the exercise of privilege do not involve, properly speaking, a net increase in statism at all. They are simply the corporate state's stabilizing restrictions on its own more fundamental forms of intervention. Silber illustrated the dialectical nature of such restrictions with reference to the question of whether pharmacists ought to be able to refuse to sell items, such as morning-after pills, that violate their conscience. The atomistic libertarian response is, of course, the right to sell or not to sell is a fundamental free market liberty. The implicit assumption here, as Silber pointed out, is that this dispute arises in a society which is essentially free. But pharmacists are in fact direct beneficiaries of compulsory occupational licensing, a statist racket whose central purpose is to restrict competition and enable them to charge a monopoly price for their services. Silber wrote, "The major point is a very simple one. The pharmacy profession is a state-enforced monopoly. In other words, the consumer and the pharmacist are not equal competitors on the playing field. The state has placed its thumb firmly on the scales and on one side only. That is the crucial point from which all further analysis must flow. The state has created a government-enforced monopoly for licensed pharmacists. Given that central fact, the least the state can do is ensure that everyone has access to the drugs they require, and whether a particular pill is of life and death importance is for the individual who wants it to decide, not the pharmacist, and most certainly not the government. When the state confers a special privilege on an occupation, a business firm, or an industry, and then sets regulatory limits on the use of that privilege, the regulation is not a new intrusion of statism into a free market. It is rather the state's limitation and qualification of its own underlying statism. The secondary regulation is not a net increase but a net reduction in statism. On the other hand, Repeal of the secondary regulation without an accompanying repeal of the primary privilege would be a net increase in statism. Since the beneficiaries of privilege are a de facto branch of the state, the elimination of regulatory constraints on their abuse of privilege has the same practical effect as repealing a constitutional restriction on the state's exercise of its own powers. To expand Spangler's bagman analogy, a great deal of alleged statism amounts to the gunman telling the bagman, after the victim has handed his wallet over at gunpoint, to give the victim back enough money for cab fare so he can safely get back home and keep on earning money to be robbed of. When the state is controlled by legal plunderers, and every decision for or against state intervention in a particular circumstance reflects their strategic assessment of the ideal mixture of intervention and non-intervention, it's a mistake for a genuine anti-state movement to allow the priorities for free market reform to be set by the plunderer's estimation of what forms of intervention no longer serve their purpose. If the corporate representatives in government are proposing a particular free market reform, you can bet your bottom dollar it's because they believe it will increase the net political extraction of wealth. The corporate ruling class's approach to free market reform is a sort of mirror image of lemon socialism. Under lemon socialism, the political capitalists, acting through the state, choose to nationalize those industries that corporate capital will most benefit from having taken off its hands, and to socialize those functions the cost of which capital would most prefer the state to bear. They shift functions from the private to the state sector when they are perceived as necessary for the functioning of the system, but not sufficiently profitable to justify the bother of running them under private sector auspices. Under lemon market reform, on the other hand, the political capitalists liquidate interventionist policies after they have squeezed all the benefit out of state action. A good example: British industrialists felt it was safe to adopt free trade in the mid-19th century after mercantilism had served its purpose. Half the world had been hammered into a unified market by British force of arms and was held together by a British merchant fleet. Britain had stamped out competing industry in the colonial world. It had reenacted the enclosures on a global scale, stealing enormous amounts of land from native populations and converting it to cash crops for the imperial market. The commanding position of British capital was the direct result of past mercantilism. Having established this commanding position, it could afford free trade. The so-called free trade movement in the contemporary United States follows the same pattern. A century ago, high tariff barriers served the interests of American political capitalists. Today, when the dominant corporate interests in America are transnational, tariffs are no longer useful to them. They actually impede the transfer of goods and partially finished products between the national subdivisions of a single global corporation. On the other hand, so-called intellectual property today serves exactly the same protectionist function for transnational corporations that tariffs used to serve for the old national corporations a century ago. So the political capitalists promote a version of free trade that involves doing away with outmoded tariff barriers while greatly strengthening the new protectionism of intellectual property law. We must remember that the measure of statism inheres in the functioning of the overall system, not in the formal statism of its separate parts. A reduction in the formal statism of some separate parts, chosen in accordance with the strategic priorities of the statists, may actually result in a net increase in the overall level of statism. Our strategic agenda as libertarians, in dismantling the state, must reflect our understanding of the overall nature of the system. Free trade is fair trade. An anarchist looks at world trade. Joe Peacott, 2000. Many of those who oppose the World Trade Organization, WTO, advocate something they call fair trade, in contrast to the free trade that the WTO advocates. In fact, the kind of commerce promoted by the WTO is anything but free, while the alternatives defended by its opponents are in no way fair. Both the WTO and most of its critics, who range from old-fashioned right-wing nationalists to labor activists, environmentalists, and leftists of various kinds, favor continued government intervention in economic activities, whether domestic or international. And any such state-regulated trade will never be either free or fair. All governments around the world interfere in the economies of the countries they rule and intervene in cross-border trade on a regular basis. They subsidize some businesses, like agriculture in the United States and Europe, pay for international advertising for wealthy corporations, and institute tariffs and custom rules that ban or complicate the free flow of goods between people on opposite sides of political borders. Such rules and regulations favor powerful domestic businesses at the expense of producers in other countries. Free trade agreements and organizations like NAFTA and WTO may alter some of the details of this intervention, but do not challenge the principle that governments are entitled to tell their subjects what they may and may not buy and whom they may trade with. Under NAFTA, for instance, it is illegal to buy lower-priced therapeutic drugs in Canada and resell them in the United States. WTO does not propose to free up trade between individuals either. It sets rules which the bureaucrats who run the organization feel best serve the interests of corporations favored by the various governments that make it up. It does not even take into consideration private, voluntary arrangements among individuals and groups, unsupervised by regulatory bodies, customs officials, border guards, public health functionaries, coast guards, etc. It just promotes continued government oversight of people trying to engage in commerce with each other. Most critics of WTO also advocate government supervision of economic matters. Unions urge governments to bar imports of goods which sell more cheaply than those produced by their members. Environmentalists want governments to implement regulations that protect wildlife and limit pollution. Human rights activists want governments to force businesses to allow their employees to organize to improve their working conditions. The goals of these people are admirable, protecting well-paid jobs, defending plants and animals against exploitation and death, and enabling low-wage workers to improve their economic status. However, the means advocated to achieve these goals are the same sort WTO promotes: government force. No one seems to be proposing an alternate means of achieving a better world for working people in all countries, as well as the beings with whom we share this planet. Many have expressed concerns about the WTO weakening national sovereignty, implying that the United States government is a force for good that should be defended. They seem to forget that the federal government robs workers in this country while dispensing corporate welfare. Such critics fail to understand that the United States and other national governments routinely limit individual sovereignty, the only kind that is really important. Different levels of government may be more or less oppressive or just, depending on the specific situation and the specific interests of the individual concerned, but none have any moral justification for any of their actions. They all steal money from workers in the form of taxes, enforce laws perpetuating unfair land ownership, maintain a monopoly on the means of exchange, and defend the unjustly gained wealth of the rich, thus impoverishing working people. And they should all be opposed. Protesters against WTO have pointed out that it is not democratic, unlike at least some of the national governments to which it is contrasted. Granted, the governments of the United States, the European Union, Canada, India, Japan, and elsewhere are elected democratic ones, but this does not mean they are legitimate, benign, or represent the interests of individual residents of the countries they rule. The democratic government of the United States, for instance, makes war on people in Kosovo and Iraq, supports the Chinese police state, subsidizes the growing of tobacco and other favored crops in the United States, and bans the domestic use of therapeutic drugs available in other countries. And this is the same government some critics of WTO seem to feel can be an advocate for the interests of the world's workers and natural environment. We need to get the various national democratic governments, as well as the WTO, off the backs of the people they push around and brutalize. If democracy, like voting, really changed anything, it would be prohibited. Abolishing WTO and NAFTA will not benefit working people here or abroad. Abolishing government would. Stemming cross-border trade will not raise the wages of Mexican workers, improve conditions in Malaysian factories, or lighten the load of Chinese farmers and laborers. International trade has not hurt these people. International governments have, by restricting their freedoms in such a way that they have little choice but to slave away at unjust wages for wealthy others. Governments all over the world deny their working subjects economic freedom and favor the interests of the wealthy owners of land and industry, thus impoverishing the many and enriching the few, who in turn enrich the politicians. Real free trade would look nothing like what exists now or would exist with WTO in charge. Without governments to prohibit people from living their lives as they see fit, free people would set up their own forms of money in banks to increase the availability of credit to regular people. Their money would not be stolen from them by predatory governments. They would not be disarmed by their democratic representatives and rendered unable to defend their land and property from voracious multinational corporations favored by politicians. They would not be forced by governments to pay rent to landowners who can claim title to land and property only because governments support ownership of land neither used nor occupied by the owners. And workers would be free to take possession of the factories and other means of production which they currently use, since there would be no government to enforce the demand of the current owners for a portion of the labor of others. Without having to sacrifice any portion of the wealth generated by their own labor, free workers would be affluent workers. Such people would be free to exchange goods and services with others, regardless of geographic location or ethnicity, as long as the interaction was voluntary. If trade were really free, the only exchanges that people would agree to would be fair ones. And true, unhindered competition between various worker owners all over the world would prevent some from accumulating vast amounts of wealth at the expense of others. Real free trade would be risky in ways that a government-subsidized economy would not be. There would be no state-run welfare system, no labor laws, no laws against pollution and the wanton slaughter of wildlife. But that does not mean individuals and the natural environment would be set adrift to fend for themselves. People are more than capable of forming voluntary organizations to provide for hard times, assist each other with creating jobs, facilitate direct commerce between producers, and campaign for a more humane treatment of non-human beings. People free to trade with each other would also be free to look at the ways they live and work, and come up with ways to do both that are more humane and ecologically sound than those that currently exist. They have done this all through history and do it now alongside the institutions of the warfare-welfare state. Anarchy and free trade would not solve all problems or lead to utopia. They simply would free up people to interact with others as they choose, to the benefit of both or all parties. Individuals and voluntary associations would then be free to trade fairly with each other, band together as they see fit to promote their common interests, and protect their shared environment, all without being pushed around by politicians and the economic elites they empower and defend. 2 words on privatization. Charles W. Johnson, 2007. Left-libertarians, like all libertarians, believe that all state control of industry and all state ownership of natural resources should be abolished. In that sense, libertarian leftists advocate complete and absolute privatization of, well, everything. Governments or quasi-governmental public monopolies have no business building or running roads, bridges, railroads, airports, parks, housing, libraries, post offices, television stations, electric lines, power plants, waterworks, oil rigs, gas pipelines, or anything else of the sort. Those of us who are anarchists add that governments have no business building or running fire departments, police stations, courts, armies, or anything else of the sort, because governments, which are necessarily coercive and necessarily elitist, have no business existing or doing anything at all. It's hard enough to sell this idea to our fellow leftists just on the merits. State leftists have a long-standing and healthy skepticism towards the more utopian claims that are sometimes made about how businesses might act on the free market. Meanwhile, they have a long-standing and very unhealthy naivete towards the utopian claims that are often made on behalf of government bureaucracies under an electoral form of government. Footnote: see Charles Johnson, State of Grace, Rad Geek People's Daily, no publisher, October 9, 2005, radgeek.com. But setting the substantive issues aside, there's another major roadblock for us to confront just from the use of language. There is something called privatization, which has been a hot topic for the past 15 to 20 years. It has been a big deal in Eastern Europe, in third world countries under the influence of the IMF, and in some cases in the United States too. Naomi Klein has a new book on the topic, which focuses on the role that natural and artificial crises play in establishing the conditions for what she calls privatization. Footnote: Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, New York Metropolitan, 2007. But privatization, as understood by the IMF, the neoliberal governments, and the robber baron corporations, is a very different beast from privatization as understood by free market radicals. What consistent libertarians advocate is the devolution of all wealth to the people who created it, and the reconstruction of all industry on the principle of free association and voluntary mutual exchange. But the IMF and Naomi Klein both seem to agree on the idea that privatization includes reforms like the following: tax-funded government contracts to corporations like Blackwater or DynCorp for private mercenaries to fight government wars. This has become increasingly popular as a way for the U.S. to wage small and large wars over the past 15 years. I think it was largely pioneered through the U.S. government's efforts to suppress international free trade in unauthorized drugs, and is currently heavily used by the U.S. in Colombia, the Balkans, and Iraq. Tax-funded government contracts to corporations like Wackenhut for government-funded but privately managed prisons, police forces, firefighters, etc. This has also become increasingly popular in the U.S. over the past 15 years. In the case of prisons, at least, it was largely inspired by the increasing number of people imprisoned by the U.S. government for using unauthorized drugs or selling them to willing customers. Government auctions or sweetheart contracts in which nationalized monopoly firms, oil companies, waterworks, power companies, and the like, are sold off to corporations with the profits going into the state treasury, and usually with some form of legally enforced monopoly left intact after privatization. One of the most notorious cases is the cannibalistic bonanza that Boris Yeltsin and a select class of politically connected oligarchs helped themselves to after the implosion of Soviet communism. Throughout the Third World, similar auction or contract schemes are suggested or demanded as a condition for the national government to receive a line of tax-funded credit from the member states of the International Monetary Fund. Yet another damn account schemes for converting government pension systems from a welfare model to a forced savings model, in which workers are forced to put part of their paycheck into a special government-created retirement account, where it can be invested according to government-crafted formulas in one of a limited number of government-approved investment vehicles offered by a tightly regulated cartel of government-approved uncompetitive investment brokers. This kind of government retirement plan is supposedly the centerpiece of privatization in Pinochet's Chile and has repeatedly been advocated by George W. Bush and other Republican politicians in the United States. Klein and other state leftists very often claim that these government privatization schemes are closely associated with right-wing authoritarian repression up to and including secret police, death squads, and beating, torturing, or disappearing innocent people for exercising their rights of free speech or free association in labor unions or dissent groups. And they are right. Those police-state tactics aren't compatible with any kind of free market, but then neither are any of the government auctions, government contracting, government loans, and government regulatory schemes that Klein and her comrades present as examples of privatization. They are examples of government-backed corporate kleptocracy. The problem is that the oligarchs, the robber barons, and their hirelings dishonestly present these schemes, one and all of them involving massive government intervention and government plunder from ordinary working people, as if they were free market reforms. And Klein and her comrades usually believe them. The worst sorts of robber baron state capitalism are routinely presented as if they were arguments against the free market, even though pervasive government monopoly, government regulation, government confiscation, government contracting, and government finance have nothing even remotely to do with free markets. I'd like to suggest that this confusion needs to be exposed and combated. In order to combat it, we may very well need to mint some new language. As far as I know, privatization was coined by analogy with nationalization. If nationalization was the seizure of industry or resources by government, then privatization was the reversal of that process, devolving the industry or the resources into private hands. It is clear that the kind of government outsourcing and kleptocratic monopolies that Klein et al. Condemn don't match up very well with the term. On the other hand, the term has been abused and perverted so long that it may not be very useful to us anymore either. So here's my proposal for linguistic reform. What we advocate is the devolution of state-confiscated wealth and state-confiscated industries back to civil society. In some cases, that might mean transferring an industry or a resource to private proprietorship if, for example, you can find the person or the people from whom a nationalized factory was originally seized. The just thing to do would be to turn the factory back over to them. But in most cases, it could just as easily mean any number of other ways to devolve property back to the people. 1. Some resources should be ceded to the joint ownership of those who habitually use them. For example, who should own your neighborhood streets? Answer: you and your neighbors should own the streets that you live on. For the government to seize your tax money and your land and use it to build neighborhood roads, and then to sell them out from under you to some unrelated third party who doesn't live on them, doesn't habitually use them, etc., would be theft. 2. Government industries and lands where an original private owner cannot be found could and probably should be devolved to the cooperative ownership of the people who work in them or on them. The factories to the workers, the soil to those who till it. 3. Some universally used utilities, waterworks, regional power companies, perhaps highways, which were created by tax money, might be ceded to the joint ownership of all the citizens of the area they serve. This is somewhat similar to the Czechoslovakian model of privatization, in which government industries were converted into joint stock companies, and every citizen was given so many shares. 4. Some resources, many parks perhaps, might be ceded to the unorganized public. That is, they would become real public property in Roderick's sense, rather than in the sense of government control. Footnote: see Roderick Long, A Plea for Public Property, Chapter 15, pages 157 to 168 in this volume. Now, given the diversity of cases and all of the different ways in which government might justly devolve property from state control to civil society, privatization is really too limiting a term. So instead, let's call what we want the socialization of the means of production. As for the IMF Blackwater model of privatization, again, the word doesn't fit the situation very well, and we need something new in order to help mark the distinction. Whereas what we want could rightly be called socialization, I think that the government outsourcing, government-backed monopoly capitalism, and government goon squads might more accurately be described as privateering. I'm just saying. Where are the specifics? Karl Hess, 1969. Libertarianism is clearly the most, perhaps the only, truly radical movement in America. It grasps the problems of society by the roots. It is not reformist in any sense. It is revolutionary in every sense. Because so many of its people, however, have come from the right, there remains about it at least an aura, or perhaps miasma, of defensiveness, as though its interests really center in, for instance, defending private property. The truth, of course, is that libertarianism wants to advance principles of property, but that it in no way wishes to defend, willy-nilly, all property which is now called private. Much of that property is stolen. Much is of dubious title. All of it is deeply intertwined with an immoral, coercive state system which has condoned, built upon, and profited from slavery, has expanded through and exploited a brutal and aggressive imperial and colonial foreign policy, and continues to hold the people in a roughly serf-master relationship to political economic power concentrations. Libertarians are concerned, first and foremost, with that most valuable of properties, the life of each individual. That is the property most brutally and constantly abused by state systems, whether they are of the right or left. Property rights pertaining to material objects are seen by libertarians as stemming from, and as importantly secondary to the right to own, direct, and enjoy one's own life, and those appurtenances thereto which may be acquired without coercion. Libertarians, in short, simply do not believe that theft is proper, whether it is committed in the name of a state, a class, a crisis, a credo, or a cliché. This is a far cry from sharing common ground with those who want to create a society in which super-capitalists are free to amass vast holdings and who say that that is ultimately the most important purpose of freedom. This is proto-heroic nonsense. Libertarianism is a people's movement and a liberation movement. It seeks the sort of open, non-coercive society in which the people, the living, free, distinct people, may voluntarily associate, disassociate, and, as they see fit, participate in the decisions affecting their lives. This means a truly free market in everything from ideas to idiosyncrasies. It means people free collectively to organize the resources of their immediate community or individualistically to organize them. It means the freedom to have a community-based and supported judiciary where wanted, none where not, or private arbitration services where that is seen as most desirable. The same with police, the same with schools, hospitals, factories, farms, laboratories, parks, and pensions. Liberty means the right to shape your own institutions. It opposes the right of those institutions to shape you simply because of accreted power or gerontological status. For many, however, these root principles of radical libertarianism will remain mere abstractions and even suspect until they are developed into aggressive, specific proposals. There is scarcely anything radical about, for instance, those who say that the poor should have a large share of the federal budget. That is reactionary, asking that the institution of state theft be made merely more palatable by distributing its loot to more sympathetic persons. Perhaps no one of sound mind could object more to giving federal funds to poor people than to spending the money on the slaughter of Vietnamese peasant fighters. But to argue such relative merits must end being simply reformist and not revolutionary. Libertarians could and should propose specific revolutionary tactics and goals which would have specific meaning to poor people and to all people, to analyze in depth and to demonstrate in example the meaning of liberty, revolutionary liberty, to them. I, for one, earnestly beseech such thinking from my comrades. The proposals should take into account the revolutionary treatment of stolen private and public property in libertarian, radical, and revolutionary terms, the factors which have oppressed people so far, and so forth. Murray Rothbard and others have done much theoretical work along these lines, but it can never be enough for just a few to shoulder so much of the burden. Let me propose just a few examples of the sort of specific revolutionary and radical questions to which members of our movement might well address themselves. Land ownership and or usage in a situation of declining state power. The Tijerina situation suggests one approach. There must be many others. And what about, realistically, not romantically, water and air pollution liability and prevention? Worker, shareowner, community roles or rights in productive facilities in terms of libertarian analysis and as specific proposals in a radical and revolutionary context. What, for instance, might or should happen to General Motors in a liberated society? Of particular interest, to me at any rate, is focusing libertarian analysis and ingenuity on finding the great unfinished business of the abolition of slavery. Simply setting slaves free in a world still owned by their masters obviously was a historic inequity. Libertarians hold that the South should have been permitted to secede, so the slaves themselves, along with their northern friends, could have built a revolutionary liberation movement, overthrown the masters, and thus shaped the reparations of revolution. Thoughts of reparations today are clouded by concern that it would be taken out against innocent persons who in no way could be connected to former oppression. There is an area where that could be avoided, in the use of government-owned lands and facilities as items of exchange in compensating the descendants of slaves and making it possible for them to participate in the communities of the land finally as equals and not wards. Somewhere, I must assume, there is a libertarian who, sharing the idea, might work out a good and consistent proposal for justice in that area. Obviously, the list is endless, but the point is finite and finely focused. With libertarianism now developing as a movement, it earnestly and urgently requires innovative proposals, radical and specific goals, and a revolutionary agenda which can translate its great and enduring principles into timely and commanding courses of possible and even practical action. Confiscation and the Homestead Principle. Murray and Rothbard, 1969. Karl Hess's brilliant and challenging article in this issue raises a problem of specifics that ranges further than the libertarian movement. Footnote: Karl Hess, 1969. Where are the specifics? Chapter 31, pages 289 to 292 in this volume. For example, there must be hundreds of thousands of professional anti-communists in this country, yet not one of these gentry, in the course of their fulminations, has come up with a specific plan for decommunization. Suppose, for example, that Messrs. Brezhnev and Company became converted to the principles of a free society. Then they ask our anti-communists, all right, how do we go about desocializing? What could our anti-communists offer them? This question has essentially been answered by the exciting development of Tito's Yugoslavia. Beginning in 1952, Yugoslavia has been desocializing at a remarkable rate. The principle the Yugoslavs have used is the libertarian homesteading one, the state-owned factories to the workers that work in them. The nationalized plants in the public sector have all been transferred in virtual ownership to the specific workers who work in the particular plants, thus making them producers' co-ops and moving rapidly in the direction of individual shares of virtual ownership to the individual worker. What other practicable route towards destatization could there be? The principle in the communist countries should be land to the peasants and the factories to the workers, thereby getting the property out of the hands of the state and into private homesteading hands. The homesteading principle means that the way that unowned property gets into private ownership is by the principle that this property justly belongs to the person who finds, occupies, and transforms it by his labor. This is clear in the case of the pioneer and virgin land, but what of the case of stolen property? Suppose, for example, that A steals B's horse. Then C comes along and takes the horse from A. Can C be called a thief? Certainly not, for we cannot call a man a criminal for stealing goods from a thief. On the contrary, C is performing a virtuous act of confiscation, for he is depriving thief A of the fruits of his crime of aggression, and he is at least returning the horse to the innocent private sector and out of the criminal sector. C has done a noble act and should be applauded. Of course, it would be still better if he returned the horse to B, the original victim, but even if he does not, the horse is far more justly in C's hands than it is in the hands of A, the thief and criminal. Let us now apply our libertarian theory of property to the case of property in the hands of, or derived from, the state apparatus. The libertarian sees the state as a giant gang of organized criminals who live off the theft called taxation and use the proceeds to kill, enslave, and generally push people around. Therefore, any property in the hands of the state is in the hands of thieves and should be liberated as quickly as possible. Any person or group who liberates such property, who confiscates or appropriates it from the state, is performing a virtuous act and a signal service to the cause of liberty. In the case of the state, furthermore, the victim is not readily identifiable as B, the horse owner. All taxpayers, all draftees, all victims of the state have been mulcted. How to go about returning all this property to the taxpayers? What proportions should be used in this terrific tangle of robbery and injustice that we all have suffered at the hands of the state? Often, the most practical method of destatizing is simply to grant the moral right of ownership on the person or group who seizes the property from the state. Of this group, the most morally deserving are the ones who are already using the property, but who have no moral complicity in the state's act of aggression. These people then become the homesteaders of the stolen property, and hence the rightful owners. Take, for example, state universities. This is property built on funds stolen from the taxpayers. Since the state has not found or put into effect a way of returning ownership of this property to the tax-paying public, the proper owners of this university are the homesteaders, those who have already been using and therefore mixing their labor with the facilities. The prime consideration is to deprive the thief, in this case the state, as quickly as possible of the ownership and control of its ill-gotten gains, to return the property to the innocent private sector. This means student and/or faculty ownership of the universities. As between the two groups, the students have a prior claim, for the students have been paying at least some amount to support the university, whereas the faculty suffer from the moral taint of living off state funds and thereby becoming to some extent a part of the state apparatus. The same principle applies to nominally private property, which really comes from the state as a result of zealous lobbying on behalf of the recipient. Columbia University, for example, which receives nearly 2/3 of its income from government, is only a private college in the most ironic sense. It deserves a similar fate of virtuous homesteading confiscation. But if Columbia University, what of General Dynamics? What of the myriad of corporations which are integral parts of the military-industrial complex, which not only get over half or sometimes virtually all their revenue from the government, but also participate in mass murder? What are their credentials to private property? surely less than zero. As eager lobbyists for these contracts and subsidies, as co-founders of the garrison state, they deserve confiscation and reversion of their property to the genuine private sector as rapidly as possible. To say that their private property must be respected is to say that the property stolen by the horse thief and the murdered, must be respected. But how then do we go about destatizing the entire mass of government property as well as the private property of general dynamics? All this needs detailed thought and inquiry on the part of libertarians. One method would be to turn over ownership to the homesteading workers in the particular plants, another to turn over pro rata ownership to the individual taxpayers. But we must face the fact that it might prove the most practical route to first nationalize the property as a prelude to redistribution. Thus, how could the ownership of General Dynamics be transferred to the deserving taxpayers without first being nationalized en route? And furthermore, even if the government should decide to nationalize General Dynamics, without compensation of course, per se and not as a prelude to redistribution to the taxpayers, this is not immoral or something to be combated. For it would only mean that one gang of thieves, the government, would be confiscating property from another previously cooperating gang, the corporation that has lived off of the government. I do not often agree with John Kenneth Galbraith, but his recent suggestion to nationalize businesses which get more than 75% of their revenue from the government or from the military has considerable merit. Certainly it does not mean aggression against private property, and furthermore, we could expect a considerable diminution of zeal from the military-industrial complex if much of the profits were taken out of war and plunder. And besides, it would make the American military machine less efficient, being governmental, and that is surely all to the good. But why stop at 75%? 50% seems to be a reasonable cutoff point on whether an organization is largely public or largely private. And there is another consideration. Dow Chemical, for example, has been heavily criticized for making napalm for the U.S. military machine. The percentage of its sales coming from napalm is undoubtedly small, so that on a percentage basis the company may not seem very guilty, but napalm is and can only be an instrument of mass murder, and therefore Dow Chemical is heavily up to its neck in being an accessory and hence a co-partner in the mass murder in Vietnam. No percentage of sales, however small, can absolve its guilt. This brings us to Karl's point about slaves. One of the tragic aspects of the emancipation of the serfs in Russia in 1861 was that while the serfs gained their personal freedom, the land, their means of production and of life, their land was retained under the ownership of their feudal masters. The land should have gone to the serfs themselves, for under the Homestead principle they had tilled the land and deserved its title. Furthermore, the serfs were entitled to a host of reparations from their masters for the centuries of oppression and exploitation. The fact that the land remained in the hands of the lords paved the way inexorably for the Bolshevik Revolution, since the revolution that had freed the serfs remained unfinished. The same is true of the abolition of slavery in the United States. The slaves gained their freedom, it is true, but the land, the plantations that they had tilled and therefore deserved to own under the Homestead principle, remained in the hands of their former masters. Furthermore, no reparations were granted the slaves for their oppression out of the hides of their masters. Hence, the abolition of slavery remains unfinished, and the seeds of a new revolt have remained to intensify to the present day. Hence the great importance of the shift in Negro demands from greater welfare handouts to reparations for the years of slavery and exploitation and for the failure to grant the Negroes their land, the failure to heed the radical abolitionists' call for 40 acres and a mule to the former slaves. In many cases, moreover, the old plantations and the heirs and descendants of the former slaves can be identified, and the reparations can become highly specific indeed. Alan Milchman, in the days when he was a brilliant young libertarian activist, first pointed out that libertarians had misled themselves by making their main dichotomy government versus private, with the former bad and the latter good. Government, he pointed out, is after all not a mystical entity, but a group of individuals, private individuals if you will, acting in the manner of an organized criminal gang. But this means that there may also be private criminals as well as people directly affiliated with the government. What we libertarians object to, then, is not government per se, but crime. What we object to is unjust or criminal property titles. What we are for is not private property per se, but just innocent, non-criminal private property. It is justice versus injustice, innocence versus criminality that must be our major libertarian focus.